and everything in a second is kind of, yeah, the enthusiasm goes down. But we have an excellent program for the day. So I hope to bring it back, your enthusiasm like we had yesterday. So, we are starting our program a little late today, and I'll invite Professor Casey Ting here on the podium to introduce our featured speaker, keynote speaker for this morning. At the beginning, we thought we will give you a brief one-slide presentation of what did we hear yesterday from all these presentations. As I mentioned, we have a couple of very hardworking people in our group. They synthesize everything that we heard yesterday, and just like to refresh your memory, we thought we will go ahead and talk for about 3, 4, 5 minutes with yesterday's highlights. Can you please put the slides? Technical problem there. Okay, can you see a lot of things up there? And we thought that's the only way we can put it up there. So, a lot of presentations, a lot of posters, keynotes, and from panel meetings that we had yesterday. These are the few things that came up. Some of the very key words that we had it out there. So the purpose is to bring it back to your memory, and then we are going to use all this information that we had into tomorrow, Wednesday, another fun session that we will have in roadmap development. So here is what the common themes that came from yesterday. The majority of the post-harvest losses, we heard from Brazil to Africa, India, China, US, from everywhere else. So we know when we synthesize this information, we found that post-harvest losses occur, and they are preventable. Some of these problems of the post-harvest loss start at the production level. We also heard a lot about, post-harvest loss measurement is very important, but also needs to be standardized so that, we have a common understanding and a common method and a common protocol for post-harvest loss measurement. People also talked about long-term sustainable solutions, and these solutions should be in a way that it should engage government. And we had few government representatives here from different parts of the world. And that was a key item that we talked about. We need to engage the government in our initiatives. This long-term solution should be market-driven. It should consider the value chain, not just only one, from harvest all the way to the consumer. Most of those post-harvest loss prevention or interventions should be, region-specific. And we also talked about, locally targeted, but maybe have global impact. We also talked about our efforts, or the way to start this post-harvest loss prevention strategies. We should have a multiple stakeholder input and engage our multiple stakeholders. Of course, we have to have we have to minimize the negative environmental impact for all the works that we do. Consider the end goal. What's the end goal for your specific project that you are targeting for the specific reason? Is your goal for post-harvest loss reduction? Is it going to contribute to food security? Or your ultimate goal is to improve life and livelihood of smallholder farmers? Or maybe all of them. So we heard in several presentations, these discussions. We also talked about the importance of culture and cultural practices to remove some of the barriers. So there are some excellent presentations. People talk about behavioral changes, how can we accomplish those. And most importantly, you all have attended many different sessions yesterday. So at the end of the day today or the first thing in the morning, please bring it back, your notes. What are the common themes that you have noticed from these presentations? People from listening to people from different parts of the world, or your own experience. So all of that would be brought into first thing tomorrow morning when we assemble here around 8:30, 8:39 tomorrow. We are going to have Professor Toby Peters will facilitate the session. President Emeritus Dr. Robert Easter will be the group leader tomorrow morning. We would like to see everybody tomorrow, and I think constantly we'll keep on reminding you for roadmap development and all of that. Dr. Kathy Parla, do I supposed to say anything else? That's it? Thank you. So it's now my pleasure to invite Professor K.C. Ting. He is my boss, actually, department head of agricultural biological engineering. Professor Ting has a lot of awards winning. He's a fellow of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. He's a fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and he has a whole lifetime experience of working in the systems and putting things together in energy, food security, and post-harvest losses and all. He originally comes from the National Taiwan University, and then he did his master's at University of Kentucky and PhD at University of Illinois. After that, he had professional career at different parts of the U.S., and right now, he is recognized as an authority on food security kind of issues, post-harvest losses, energy, and things like that. So it's my privilege to introduce Professor K.C. Ting to this podium.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalita. He knows more about me than myself, so that's good. And when I speak, I never get any applause like that, So, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be able to stand here and introduce the keynote speaker today. I got this assignment only 20 minutes before now, so you have to bear with me if I make any mistake. When you work, Dr. Kalita is an amazing person, and he is a perfectionist. So I hope I can live up to the expectation. So if you work with Dr. Kalita, you have to stay alert all the time because you never know what's going to happen to you. So, thank you very much for the opportunity. On your program, there are two keynote speakers listed on page 19, but Mr. Hu Jun Lee's presentation was made yesterday, so we have only one keynote speaker today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Toby Peters. Professor Peters is an award-winning strategist and advocate. He co-founded both Highview Power Storage and Dearman, and with them established the concept of liquid nitrogen. It says liquid air. Actually, he corrected me. It's nitrogen as an energy storage solution for both grid and transport, delivering clean cooling and power. So under his leadership, Dearman has grown to employ more than 50 people, predominantly engineers. And the company's technology has progressed rapidly with the first application nearing commercial deployment. During his career, Professor Peters has established clean cooling within the mainstream energy debate and helped secure some £20 million of UK grant funding for clean cooling development, as well as more than another additional £12 million of inward investment into the UK for technology development. Professor Peters is also a visiting professor in power and cold economy within the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences at the University of Birmingham. He is the academic lead of the 2015 Doing Code Smarter Policy Commission. Professor Peters, the stage is yours. Please welcome Professor Peters.
Thank you, Professor Ting, for those kind words. And thank you, Prasanta. If CD had the graveyard shift last night, I'm very aware that the first session of the morning after a great event, and to be asked to speak for half an hour, is, to coin an English rugby phrase, the hospital pass. Sir John Beddington suggested that mankind is facing a perfect storm. The human population is expected to reach almost 10 billion later this century, and growth in population means growth in demand. Demand for food, demand for water, and demand for energy. The fundamental question of our age is therefore, how can we feed a growing population and meet our need for water and supply the energy we require, while also trying to limit the worst effects of climate change? That is the perfect storm. And if we are to weaken the storm before it arrives, or at the very least find ways to weather it, then I believe, as we hear today, we must address post-harvest food loss. We live in an age which focuses heavily upon production. Governments, companies, and academics spend vast research budgets in an attempt to increase yields and generate more energy. But I argue that we must do things differently. We must utilize our resources more efficiently and effectively. And above all, we must eliminate waste. That may not be the prevailing wisdom, but it's common sense. And for me, post-harvest food loss is central to that objective. We need to increase food production, I know that. But as we hear over this conference, to grow more food will place an increasing strain on agricultural land, more and more water will be used for food production, and the use of fertilizers and pesticides will increase. That cannot be sustainable indefinitely, whereas addressing post-harvest food loss has an almost wholly positive impact. Addressing post-harvest food loss is key to global sustainability. And what's more, I think we can have a huge impact on food loss using conventional, established, and well-understood technology. I'm not calling for complex and controversial advances in microbiology. I'm not advocating development of exotic materials. And I'm not suggesting a radical rethink of economic systems and structures. I argue we need more cold or cooling. Key to addressing post-harvest food loss is the humble refrigerator. It's a concept which has been around for hundreds of years. It's not rocket science, but once again, it is common sense. Establishing comprehensive cold chains of refrigerated processing, storage, and distribution helps to substantially improve the usable life of food. And if done properly, it helps to ensure the value of the food is maintained from the moment it's harvested to the moment it's eaten. But the big question is, can this massive expansion in cooling infrastructure be delivered without having a detrimental impact on the environment? To pick up the theme of this conference, can you deliver the pathways towards post-harvest food loss with minimal environmental impact? I believe that we can, and I believe that we must. But we urgently need to leapfrog dirty, inefficient, fossil-fueled technologies of the past and establish new cold chains built on efficient and environmentally conscious foundations. To put it simply, we need to do cold smarter. Why do I believe that post-harvest food loss is so crucial to our future as a species and to the sustainability of our agricultural and economic systems? I know we've heard the numbers presented already at this conference, but until post-harvest food loss is front and center of the debate, they need to be repeated and repeated. Firstly, there is an unacceptable level of hunger in the world. About 1 in 8 people, approximately 800 million people, go to bed hungry every night. In sub-Saharan Africa, as many as 1 person in 3 is hungry today. And that feels absolutely incomprehensible to me. Here we are in Rome, one of the great culinary capitals of the world, and the opportunity to eat amazing food is seamlessly endless. But that's exactly the problem. We live in a world which is faced by famine and feast. Here we can eat to excess, yet all too many people do not have access to the minimum level of nutrition. Enough food is produced, but all too often it simply doesn't reach the people who need it at a price they can afford. And post-harvest food loss is one of the key causes of the problem. Throwing away perfectly edible food has direct impact on hunger. At the same time, we're throwing away economic value straight into the rubbish dump, and that deprives the farmer of money that could be used to aid their own development and address their own poverty. The scale of the problem is astounding. About a third of the food we produce gets lost or is wasted by consumers every year. I think that's about 1.3 billion tons of food which is chucked in the bin or ploughed back into the field. As I understand it, the food currently wasted or lost in Africa and Latin America alone could feed 600 million people. Globally, the total value of the food we grow but never eat is almost $1 trillion. That figure for me is so large it's almost meaningless, but to put it in perspective, it's about a quarter of the total US federal budget. These food losses translate into lost income for farmers, who are all too often living in poor communities, and into higher prices for consumers. It hampers development and economically growth. Equally importantly, and the reason why food loss represents the eye of the fast-approaching perfect storm, is that it increases the usage of valuable and increasingly scarce resources. We've already heard that agriculture takes up 70% of the fresh water we use globally. A vast quantity of that water is used to produce food that is ultimately destined to be destroyed. The amount of water used to produce waste food is equivalent each year to 3 times the volume of Lake Geneva. The world needs new infrastructure to collect, store, and transport food, but as first priority, we must ensure that the water we collect is put to good use. The same is true of energy. Agricultural production relies heavily on fossil fuels. The production of fertilizer alone accounts for up to 5% of global natural gas demand. When you factor in the energy used to produce food, to produce, harvest, transport, and store food, the squandering of energy in food loss is huge and entirely unacceptable. And the worst thing is, globally, we all consider food loss to be an insurmountable problem. We think it's an inevitable product of the global agricultural system. I just don't accept the logic. Having witnessed a revolution which saw food production increase dramatically and millions lifted from hunger, I now want to see a waste revolution. And I believe that cold is an absolute essential tool at our disposal. In the West, we accept that there is a seamless network of refrigerated processing, storage, distribution and retail that takes food from the farmer's field to our plates. Not only does it help to eliminate food loss and wastage, but it also ensures the public safety is not compromised by food which has been allowed to degrade. And the impact on cold of the food industry is enormous. Take the UK, for example. 70% of food in the UK is either chilled or frozen at some point in the supply chain. The total value of refrigerated food in the UK is a staggering £56 billion per year. And much of that value is derived from food processing, which is made possible by cold. But such coordinated cold chains are sadly not universal. Cold, or to be more precise, the lack of cold, is the Achilles heel of the world's developing economies. Where cold chains are either non-existent or incomplete, 200 million tons of food are lost every year. In Tanzania, for example, 25% of all milk production is wasted because it has deteriorated to such a degree it cannot be sold. 97% of the meat produced in Tanzania is sold warm, having never been refrigerated. The result is hampered development, increased poverty, and greater hunger. And for me, it begs the question, why is 95% of global research and development funding associated with food channeled towards increasing yields, when it could be focused on reducing food losses and, in particular, establishing cold infrastructure? Were this to happen, wastage could be reduced, price pressure diminished, and consumption of water and energy slashed. Cold chains would help to give some shelter from the impending perfect storm. And I'm pleased to say that change is already beginning to occur, particularly in rapidly growing economies. China has recognized the essential role of cold in developing food security and a sustainable future. In China, fridge ownership amongst urban households has risen from only 7% to more than 95% today. Simultaneously, cold storage capacity soared from just 250 million cubic feet to more than 2 billion in only 3 years. And the growth is continuing. China cold industry is reportedly expanding by 25% per year. And China has recently set new legal requirements for cold chain meat, fish, and vegetables. But China's rapid adoption of cold chain is far from complete. And while China's middle class is the second largest in the world, with some 157 million people, it still represents just 12% of the population. And that figure will alter substantially in the years to come, and so will the patterns of demand and consumption. We're estimating that by 2030, the world will have 3.2 billion middle-class people. And as international brands and organized retail takes hold, so cold chains will develop and become more cohesive to serve them with reliable, consistent food supplies. India is also going through a cold chain revolution. The Indian government has recognized that giving growing urban populations access to nutritious food at an affordable price calls for more increased yields. It requires effective processing, storage, and crucially transportation of food. But the scale of their challenge is vast. India is the world's largest producer of milk and the second largest producer of fruit and vegetables, yet it's home to more than 25% of the world's hungry poor. While more than 40% of children under 5 are undernourished, a staggering $13 billion of fresh produce is wasted annually in India. The lack of a reliable, integrated cold chain across the country is a significant contributing factor to this avoidable loss of food. In recent years, there has been significant investment in cold infrastructure, and India now has the most cold storage in the world. However, storing a product for longer is futile if it cannot be transported to market without spoiling. India doesn't just need cold, it needs cold in motion. India estimates that it needs to spend more than 20 billion on cold chain infrastructure. Almost 50% of that investment is needed for refrigerated transport. Currently, India has less than 10,000 refrigerated trucks, but according to the National Centre for Cold Chain Development, it should have 180,000 just to meet demand. Without this growth in refrigerated transport, food will inevitably continue to be lost post-harvest because it cannot reach market in good condition. And the value received by farmers and rural communities will also be diminished because food cannot reach urban or export markets and because it cannot be processed effectively to either prolong its life or increase its value. Cold, for me, also allows farmers to go up the value chain and look at process and preparing food. And the lack of a complete cold chain even diminishes the prospects of achieving higher yield. Farming communities will only produce more food if they can be convinced that they can sell it. The challenge is to take the lead shown by countries such as India and China and apply it around the world. Investment in refrigeration in developing countries could produce major social and economic gains. Research by Dr. Lisa Kitinoja, who's here today, found that cooling vegetables can produce economic benefits which far outweigh the initial investment required. A similar study by Cornell University found that investment in infrastructure can enable a substantial reduction in post-harvest food losses, which in turn helps to increase availability, reduce prices, and improve economic returns. Wasting vast quantities of food also has a massively detrimental effect on climate change. The embedded carbon with food waste is enormous. Food losses and food wastage are responsible for adding 3.3 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the planet's atmosphere every year. If that were a country, it would have the third largest carbon emissions in the world behind the USA and China. That figure begins to appear even worse when you consider the impact of methane given off by food as it rots. So the very process of dumping food is having a doubling effect on the planet. It's consuming resources used in its production, and it's creating methane in its disposal, with nobody benefiting in the middle. When the world meets in Paris shortly to discuss how we can avoid environmental catastrophe, and it begins horse trading about who should cut their emissions fastest, delegates should rather commit to addressing food waste. It's unnecessary, it's hugely inefficient, and it has to stop because of the vast climate impact of post-harvest food loss. And because 200 million tons of food is wasted each year because countries don't have established cold chains. Some argue that installing new cold infrastructure is worth doing regardless of the damage it might do. In other words, a cold chain of any sort is better than no cold chain at all. I disagree. Yes, we need to help developing and emerging countries to install infrastructure to reduce waste, but this mustn't happen at any price. The problem with existing cold chain technology is that it relies far too heavily on outdated, fossil-fueled, inefficient, and polluting technology. Take the modest transport refrigeration unit as an example. They're seemingly innocuous little white boxes that sit on top of the refrigerated truck and provide the refrigeration for the vehicle. But because transport refrigeration units have never been effectively regulated, they continue to rely on inefficient and polluting diesel engines. And as a result, one transport refrigeration unit can emit far more pollution than a larger diesel engine on a truck. In fact, transport refrigeration units emit 29 times more particulate matter and 6 times more NOx than the truck engine pulling it around. That's despite the fact that the truck engine is many times more powerful. And of course, they emit significant amounts of CO2, which undermines the positive climate effect which can be achieved by establishing a cold chain in the first place. When you start to consider the cumulative effect, the problem begins to get frightening. In Europe, there are about 1 million transport refrigeration units. Research suggests that these units emit roughly the same amount of particulate matter as 56 million diesel cars. And this pollution is having a very real, very damaging effect on people's lives. Every year, 400,000 people die prematurely in the EU because of poor air quality. Transport refrigeration units may not be the biggest culprit, but they don't need to be diesel-powered, they don't need to be inefficient, and they don't need to be disproportionately polluting. We can and we should do something about it, and it is imperative we act now. Analysis suggests that the number of transport refrigeration units on the road could reach 15 million by 2025. That's about more than 4 times the number in operation today. And unless we choose a different path, that growth will bring with it an explosion in pollution. 15 million transport refrigeration units will emit the same amount of particulate matter as up to 435 million diesel trucks, and the same amount of NOx as 90 million diesel trucks, and equates to the same pollution as would be created by more than 800 million diesel cars. This additional pollution will not directly affect people here in Rome or in London or in New York, The growth in refrigerated vehicles is being driven by India and China and Indonesia. We will see it in Africa. So the pollution will impact people in Delhi, in Beijing, in Jakarta, places where already hundreds of thousands of people die each year because of the poor quality of the air they breathe. And transport refrigeration is only one example of polluting cold chain technologies. Take cold stores and pack houses. In India, approximately 350 million people live in off-grid rural locations. There is a clear need to build new infrastructure, to establish new food pack houses and processing facilities. But to do so at present normally means diesel generators. More diesel means more CO2, and more air pollution in a country where 600,000 people die prematurely each year because of poor quality. That's a big problem. Yes, refrigerated infrastructure will bring benefits. Yes, it will help to preserve food and feed people. And yes, it will offset some of the environmental impacts of food loss. But I believe we can do things better. That's why I'm demanding a change in strategy. That's why I'm calling for clean cold. Demand for cold is increasing rapidly around the world. In fact, the demand for cooling will overtake the demand for heat by 2060. As just one example, in 2008, we consumed 300 terawatt hours of energy for air conditioning. This figure is projected to increase to 10,000 terawatt hours by the end of the century. If we don't do cold differently, that is unsustainable. Universities and governments are beginning to take note. In the UK, as Professor Ting said earlier, the University of Birmingham will soon announce the findings of the world's first policy commission on cold. It will look at how to enable the growth of clean cold and how to find sustainable alternatives to diesel. The government has also responded in the UK with funding a new thermal energy research accelerator, which will invigorate the search for new cleaner technologies and also help to bring those technologies to market at a price people can afford. The EU has even begun to develop its first ever heating and cooling strategy, a first for the EU, and I think a first for the world. I'm confident that this growth in awareness and effort will have a positive effect. It will help to bring new technologies to market that will deliver affordable and accessible clean cold. And one such technology is being developed by my company, Dearman. We're focused on delivering new clean cold and power technologies because we want to meet booming demand without creating environmental catastrophe. At the heart of our technology portfolio is the Dearman engine. It's like a conventional piston engine. It's simple to manufacture, and you'd all recognize the component parts. But unlike a diesel engine, it runs on liquid nitrogen and is entirely zero emission. It's an engine that produces no emissions of CO2 or NOx or particulate matter, but it does produce efficient power and lots of cold. We will have our first applications in full commercial trials this year and in multiple trials in multiple markets next year. So, a zero-emission transport refrigeration unit, cheaper to run than a diesel alternative, costs about the same amount to buy, as well as much, much better for the environment. And looking forward, we're working with a number of universities to provide power for transportation and from buildings. Our vision is that one day, from one tank of liquid nitrogen, or tank of cold if you like, it will be possible to run cold stores, packing houses, food processing, and refrigerated vehicles, a new zero-emission cold chain. And the infrastructure is already in place. Most developed and emerging markets already have a surplus of liquid nitrogen. India, for example, has about 3,500 tons of spare liquid nitrogen capacity every day. That's enough to run 30,000 zero-emission transport refrigeration units immediately, 3 times the size of their fleet today. If we begin to look at cold as a system in the way that people consider electricity and heat, then I believe there's a vast, untapped potential to deliver even greater environmental saving while reducing financial burden. Not just solar or other renewables, But take LNG, liquefied natural gas, as an example. I'm not an engineer. To me, LNG can best be explained as a gas which is packaged in cold. The process works by cooling the gas until it liquefies to about minus 160 degrees C. It's then transported by ship to where it's needed. Many people consider LNG as the fuel of the future, but there's a major flaw in the system. Currently, when LNG comes ashore, it's heated up, and that cold packaging is dumped in the sea. Meanwhile, 2 miles down the road, at a pack house or a cold store or on a vehicle, people are burning polluting diesel to create cold. That's madness. LNG operations in just 10 EU countries dump enough waste cold to create 27,000 tons of extremely cheap and clean liquid nitrogen per day. That's enough to run more than 200,000 transport refrigeration units. In India, a number of new LNG terminals are being proposed. These could be the hubs for clean cold chain infrastructure. But because there's no system-level thinking around cold, that joined-up approach isn't yet in place. But there is nothing to stop it becoming a reality. There is a huge potential, I think, for a new cold economy to emerge, which will bring with it cutting-edge technologies, resource-efficient systems, and innovative services. Together, these will have a significant positive impact on food loss, on the lives of farming communities, and on the environment. The world is beginning to recognize the scale of the storm which is coming our way. I hope that through events like this, leaders will begin to see that food loss is at the very heart of that storm. We could address hunger simply by producing more, but in so doing, we would exacerbate the problems of water, energy, and climate change. We need an alternative approach. We must tackle waste. And I believe cold is central to that ambition. But again, we face a choice. Do we accept old polluting infrastructure in order to address food loss? Or do we look to the future and begin to do things smarter? For me, there can only be one answer. To establish new cold chain infrastructure based on diesel would help us to win the fight against food loss, but it would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. And ultimately, we would lose the war against pollution and against environmental degradation. Globally, we have the capacity to weather the perfect storm and come out the other side with better infrastructure and more sustainable systems. We just need to make some sensible choices. In so doing, we can make the world a cleaner and cooler place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. So this is a very interesting topic. We're changing from mostly heat for processing to cold for storage or processing. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the audience. How do we manage it? Oh, please. So the question is, if I understand it, what technology was used to produce liquid nitrogen, and what's the impact on the greenhouse production of that technology? Yeah.
So the technology exists already. Air Products, BOC, Linde, Air Liquide, they produce liquid nitrogen every day as an industrial gas. The way you have to think about this is as an energy storage technology. At the moment, we think about energy storage primarily as batteries, and we store electrons. What I'm looking at is you store cold and power, not just electrons, because actually what the service you want is cold, not electrons. On the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, that, like any energy storage technology, is based on the source of the energy, but all the workings that we do use, the analysis uses grid-based electricity CO2 footprint as the input against the output. And it will deliver, even using current grid-based electricity, a significant saving over diesel technologies. So it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it's like a battery. This is a battery, but it stores cold. And so as you see an increase in renewables, you will see a decrease automatically in the CO2. But it's about time-shifting energy and using it at the right place.
There's another question over there.
Very interesting presentation, and I wholeheartedly agree with the need for cold. My question is whether you've yet done a life cycle analysis on this technology in comparison to the diesel situation you mentioned, but also in comparison to solar and batteries as another alternative. It'd be interesting to see the comparison between those three different options.
Yes, we have life cycle analysis, and I think we've got a stand upstairs where we've got some of that material available. We've just done a report on Europe. The issue is that batteries, as I said, their challenge is actually providing cold. So one of the other issues isn't, say, just around transport refrigeration units. At the University of Stony Brook in New York, they've got a bus which runs on a battery bus. Because of the demand for air conditioning, about 45% of a bus in a hot country, the energy is actually used for the air conditioning. The batteries weigh 10 tons, not to drive it, but to provide the cooling load. So using liquid air, because it stores lots of cold for those applications which require power and cold, is more effective than using a lithium-ion battery.
There's one question over there.
Yeah, just interested in the relative space efficiency of the different systems. So, if, for example, if you were going to have a cold battery on top of a refrigerated container of some description, say pallet-sized or container-sized, whatever it is, what's the relative quantity of space or eventually weight that needs to be there to keep a given volume of product cold?
So with liquid nitrogen, if you want to run, say, a 7.5-ton truck on an 8 or 12-hour shift with multiple door openings, you'd need a tank of about 200 kilos of liquid nitrogen. That's a lot smaller than you would require for batteries. Just one thing I want to be clear about here. Batteries are a great technology. Liquid nitrogen is a great technology. I'm not knocking batteries. What I want people really to look at with energy storage is the right technology with the right attributes for the right application. So you won't drive a Tesla on liquid nitrogen, but if you want cold and power, it's got a lot of benefits. So yes, it can go, the energy density for cooling, to provide cooling load, we're about 50% round trip efficiency overall end to end, but to do 8 hours with a lithium-ion battery, you're going to need a number of tons.
Yes, right there. And then third.
Thank you. But an electric battery can be recharged. And I think a nitrogen battery, when it is finished, how do you recharge it? And how is the nitrogen made liquid in the first place? What type of energy is used to bring it down to those temperatures?
So liquid nitrogen is a standard product which is distributed to a lot of manufacturing plants already. It's fully available. You refill a tank exactly the same way you refill diesel. So whereas it might take 8 hours to recharge a battery, I can refill liquid nitrogen using existing technology at a speed of 100 litres per minute. So if I've got a 200-litre tank, I can refill that in under 5 minutes. The point is that just we're not advocating that you would be using liquid nitrogen in your passenger vehicles, but where you're going from depot to depot, you can have a tank at the depot.
But how is nitrogen made liquid? What type of energy is used to make the nitrogen liquid? Is it not fossil diesel electricity?
Well, in the same way, what is used to charge a battery? It can be you take it off the grid. You're storing wrong time renewable or off-peak energy. So that can either come from solar, or it can come from gas. In the same way a battery. So you think of this exactly like energy storage, but we store cold and power, not electrons. And what I'm advocating here, liquid nitrogen, please, that's the technology I work with. But what I'm advocating here is just think about cold and how do we do clean cold? How do we do cold better in the broader environment?
Okay, Professor Meyer.
Thank you, Toby, for your presentation. I agree with you, too, in terms of whether it's liquid nitrogen. I would rather compare what you're talking about to LNG as a better comparison than necessarily batteries. And so any of the liquid fuels and alternative liquid fuels, I think, are important as we think about cold chains. The question I had with regard to nitrogen is also very good for the use in modified atmosphere, storages, for pest control and otherwise. Have you looked at your concept in that context that there could be other side benefits from using liquid nitrogen, perhaps for other purposes such as pest control, modified atmosphere storage, quality preservation versus how much temperature you may need in some balance system or whatnot too?
So the Institution of Mechanical Engineers in the UK last year did a study on this, and I think Lisa Kitanoja helped with it as well, which was to say if you put a tank of liquid nitrogen down to provide this, to provide the transport refrigeration, which gives you the volume requirement to make the economics work, what else can you use it for? You can use it for many applications, from in veterinary if you require cryogenics, to buildings, right the way through to providing nitrogen in food processes as well. So it opens up. This is really where there's a report that they've done, it's on their website, which is saying how this could enable many other associated processes, which currently are probably challenged because the volume demand is not there. But when you aggregate them together, when you come off this core opportunity, right the way down. See, one of the other things also about liquid nitrogen, which is interesting, just coming back to the cold chain, is that it enables very fast cooling. So I think one of the things that Lisa looked at was the ability to take temperature down very quickly, and then, yes, you can use it for pesticides and so on and so forth. Is there anything you want to add, Lisa?
I'm sorry. When you say, I don't use the word pesticide, it's still product protectant. If you do, nitrogen is an approved organic for organic material, so it has another side benefit of being an organic protectant, which I think is an important benefit.
Thank you. Tony Bennett from FAO, and I can only completely agree and recognize, particularly from our major client countries, the developing and transition nations where we see certainly, and there's a huge demand and rapid expansion of the application of refrigeration and a range of technologies as well. We would also agree that ideally that would be done in a space where there would be efforts to minimize the environmental impact of that range of technologies, because there are diverse technologies out there. I think also we would be interested in hearing a little, you mentioned about the Birmingham Commission, and I'm not sure if the report is final. Could you just give us one or two insights as to what is being looked at in the future based on that consultation? Because we feel that was a very interesting process And many of our countries are also interested in looking at options which they have for refrigeration or the cold economy, as you very nicely phrased it, for the future. Thank you.
So the report will be published on the 28th of November. October will be the first, when the Policy Commission is published. And one of the things it's looking to do, really, is not so much focus on technology and how you make technologies more efficient. It's actually looking to focus on system-level thinking. So, for example, how can we harness the waste cold of LNG regasification into the cold chain? If India is going to build 14 or 18 new LNG terminals and they're going to be dumping all this cold, how can we harness that to provide, should we be building the cold hubs next to the LNG terminals? Should we be moving the cold in? Equally, how can you use geothermal? How can you use waste heat and absorption chillers? So what we're trying to get people to think about is think about cold as a system level. At the moment, cold is treated as a value product at the end of the chain which comes from electricity. So this building has air conditioning. Most of what I'm trying to advocate is understand that it's a service and start with the service requirement. So when people say people need electricity, actually often what people mean is they need cooling. But we don't think of it in its own term thermally. We don't think about energy thermally, we think about it electrically. And this is saying really what the purpose of the Policy Commission is to try and get people to recognize that the majority of energy usage in this world is for thermal loads, and within that, cooling is going to grow. When you look at a data center, 60% of its energy consumption is for cooling. When you look at a supermarket, these are all processes which are thermally and all around cold, but we don't bring cold into the system level thinking. That's what I'm trying to do. Is the start point is when you look at a community, a rural community, and you say they need energy, what's the service they require at the end of the day? 50-60% of that energy is probably to provide cooling. Start from there and work backwards.
Okay, we have run out of time, but I'm going to exercise my privilege as being sitting on the stage. I have one final question. So it's very interesting, a lot of post-harvest processing requires heat for drying, and then you're generating cold. In thermal science, when you generate cold, you generate heat. You dump heat. So why not, when you store cold, at the same time, store heat? So simultaneously, you have a heat storage working with the cold storage, and then use the heat for drying, processing, use the cold for cold chain. Can you do that?
Exactly. That's exactly the idea. But you've got to start from think about the service requirement, and we don't need electricity, we need thermal, hot and cold.
Sounds like a good concluding note. Thank you very much. Let's thank Professor Peters. Poster session, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's outside. Yep.